A lot of people know about the PayPal Mafia, how the early team at PayPal went on to found and control some of the biggest tech companies today. But did you know there is a much more powerful, influential business mafia out there? One stemming from a much more shady company than PayPal, who assumed much higher positions of power all over the world. It's called the Goldman Sachs Mafia. This is Henry Paulson. Henry was a very powerful man. He was the former US Secretary of the Treasury, which meant he controlled pretty much every aspect of the federal government's finances. And during the 2008 financial crisis, he was pretty much the person in charge of the entire bailouts. He had the pleasure of choosing who to keep afloat and who to let drown in their own debts. He was the guy who essentially let Lehman Brothers implode, and the guy who made sure AIG, the insurance company, got enough money in their bailout to pay Goldman Sachs $13 billion. His pedigree? He spent 32 years at Goldman Sachs. And from 1999 to 2006, he was both its chairman and CEO. Then there's Robert Rubin, Bill Clinton's former Treasury Secretary, who oversaw the loosening of underwriting regulations that had been in place since the 30s. This made it just so much easier for investment banks to bend the rules when it comes to taking companies public. His pedigree? 26 years at Goldman Sachs, even becoming the co-chairman in 1990. The former heads of the Canadian and Italian national banks, former Goldman Sachs employees. Steve Mnuchin, Treasury Secretary under Donald Trump, served 16 years at Goldman Sachs. Robert Zoellick, former president of the World Bank, was a managing director at Goldman Sachs. Joshua Bolten, George Bush's chief of staff, served as an executive director at Goldman Sachs for 5 years. Duncan Niederauer, former CEO of the New York Stock Exchange, was also a partner at, let's say it together, Goldman Sachs. The European Central Bank, the National Bank of Greece, the Bank of England, all have employees with deep roots at Goldman. In total, more than 26 former Goldman Sachs employees have taken positions of incredible power and influence all over the world. The world seems to be almost ruled by the alumni of what is generally thought of as the most slimy, the most corrupt investment bank in the world. But how did it get to this point? This is the Goldman Sachs Mafia.
Goldman Sachs.
Goldman Sachs.
Goldman Sachs.
Goldman Sachs.
The loans that were blamed for the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression
was hit today with a record fine of $550 million.
Goldman Sachs, which had a controversial role in the global financial meltdown, one of the giants at the center of that bailout, his former employer, toxic and destructive.
Those bribes in turn resulted in $2.7 billion in losses to 1MDB.